Sylph's dad, Lors, was a half-elf of frankly unreasonable attractiveness. Pointed ears, glittering blonde hair, the physique of someone who guarded a forest watchtower and apparently did nothing else, like a woodland Ken doll who had somehow developed actual professional competence. When Sylph turned up with his lunch and a new friend, Lors recognized the Greyrat name immediately. The adults had a conversation about parenting. Sylph tugged at Rudeus's shirt. Rudeus asked if the kids could go play. Lors agreed. Rudeus then laid out a complete emergency protocol for if they didn't return before dark, because cell phones hadn't been invented yet, and someone needed to take logistics seriously. Lors looked dumbfounded. Standard reaction. Up on the hill under the big tree, Sylph confessed he had never had a friend before. Rudeus admitted he had barely left the house until recently. Two professionally unqualified social failures, embarking on friendship together. Sylph wanted to learn the magic from earlier, the warm water trick, the warm wind trick, described with the precise vocabulary of a 6-year-old who was also, somehow, an enthusiastic student. Rudeus agreed to begin his training. They practiced until the sun went down. Rudeus came home to find Paul in the entryway, with his hands on his hips radiating fury. Rudeus's first thought was that Paul had found the hidden panties, the cherished pair formerly belonging to Roxy, which he had been guarding with the devotion of a man who understood irreplaceable sentimental value. It turned out the problem was something else. Mrs. Eto had come by claiming Rudeus had punched her son Somol. Rudeus had no idea who Somol was, until he realized it must be one of the 3 mud-throwing bullies from earlier, who had apparently sustained a bruise, and decided the appropriate response was maternal complaint. Paul demanded an immediate apology. Rudeus, who found this deeply unjust, refused. Paul, who had decided listening was optional, yelled. Rudeus noted that Paul was demanding an apology without having heard a single fact. Paul, in a moment he would later identify as a serious tactical error, slapped him. The irony that he was punishing his son for allegedly resorting to violence by resorting to violence did not go unnoticed. Rudeus responded with a speech. He explained that he had always been a good son, that Paul had taken a stranger's word over his own child, and that if this was the Greyrat way, he would have to reconsider his association with the name. Paul went through approximately 4 colors. Eventually, he apologized. He asked what had actually happened. Rudeus explained calmly. He had seen 3 boys pelting a 4th with mud, intervened by throwing mud back at the ringleader, and then cleaned the victim with magic. If anyone owed an apology, it was Sylph, and Somol could go first. Paul's shoulders dropped. He was 24 years old, and his 5-year-old had just won an argument on both logical and moral grounds. He agreed to let Sylph come over to play. The incident was filed under parental failures, category avoidable. Paul's internal monologue acknowledged he had hit his son while in the middle of a lecture about not using strength against weaker people, and that he had almost told Rudeus to get out, which would have replicated the catastrophic fallout with his own father that he still regretted. He resolved to do better. He also felt, alongside the guilt, a complicated pride. His kid had out-argued him. Good kid. Almost too good. Was he even really his? He was. Zenith was not the type. Time passed. Rudeus turned 6. Mornings were sword training. Afternoons were magic practice and increasingly attempts to combine them. His specific goal was to defeat Paul in close combat within 5 years, while Paul was still in his prime. Defeating an old man later would prove nothing. He had a plan, and he was committed to it. Sylph came to the hill most days. Somol's crowd showed up a few times with older reinforcements. Rudeus drove them off. Somol's mother kept coming to complain, which is how Rudeus eventually figured out she was not especially interested in justice for her son. She was interested in Paul. She was using the children's squabbles as cover for dropping by. Somol looked embarrassed about the whole arrangement. They came 5 times, then stopped. The hilltop became Sylph and Rudeus's territory, undisputed. Their playtime was, in practice, magic training. Sylph's reserves had grown enormously, from 5 spells before getting winded to half a day of practice without difficulty. Fire remained the problem. Wind and water came easily. Fire stubbornly resisted. Rudeus learned that Sylph had grabbed a metal skewer off the hearth at age 3. The resulting burn scar explained the instinctual hesitation. Rudeus made him practice fire anyway, because fear was no excuse, and also because salmonella was a genuine risk in a world without refrigeration. Sylph practiced diligently, looking adorable with Rudeus's wand and textbook, brow furrowed in concentration. Rudeus had a thought about how attractive he was going to be when he grew up, filed it firmly under irrelevant, and continued. Sylph eventually cast Ice Pillar, intermediate tier, and it gleamed in the sunlight. Then he asked why the warm water trick wasn't in the textbook. Rudeus had been found out. He demonstrated silent spellcasting, waterfall and heat hand simultaneously, no incantation for either. Sylph watched with enormous eyes and immediately demanded to learn it. Rudeus tried to explain. Feel your way through the incantation in your head, gather the energy, push the spell out without speaking. Sylph closed his eyes, muttered and wriggled in what could only be described as a very sincere attempt, and then conjured water balls silently. Just like that. Rudeus revised his understanding of how difficult this was supposed to be. Apparently Sylph had unusual talent, or Rudeus had been overestimating the difficulty, possibly both. Rudeus had Sylph practice all his spells without incantations. Then it started raining, because Rudeus had been too absorbed watching Sylph learn to notice the clouds. They ran for the Greyrat estate. Lilia the maid met them at the door with towels already in hand. She had clearly seen the downpour coming, took one look at Sylph's face, went back inside, and returned with an additional cloth. No questions. Towels simply appeared. This was why she was good at her job. They went upstairs to dry off. Rudeus undressed without ceremony. He turned around and found Sylph standing frozen, bright red, fidgeting. Rudeus helped him out of his coat. Then he reached for the lower garments. Sylph grabbed his arm and said no very firmly. Rudeus promised not to laugh. Sylph said through tears that wasn't the issue. Rudeus registered that the resistance was unusual. Sylph had never refused anything so firmly before. And then, in a moment of what he would later call a mischievous impulse, and what the historical record would call a catastrophically poor decision, yanked the underwear down anyway. Sylph shrieked. Rudeus's vision went white. What he had just seen was not what he expected. Sylph was not a boy. At all. Sylph curled into a ball on the floor and cried. Rudeus stood holding the underwear. Paul arrived home at this exact moment. Paul walked in, took in the scene, and made a visible effort not to immediately start yelling. He had learned something from the last time. He put Sylph in the care of Zenith and Lilia, helped Rudeus clean up, and with the patience of a man actively working on himself, asked what had happened. Rudeus apologized. Paul told him to be nice to girls. Paul told him to apologize to Sylphiette, her full name, which Rudeus was learning for the first time. Rudeus asked if she would forgive him. Paul said, "You don't apologize to guarantee forgiveness. You apologize because it's right." Rudeus stood up, went to Sylphiette, and said, "I'm sorry, Sylphie. Your hair's short, and so I thought you were a boy this whole time." Paul, who had always believed his son was basically perfect, revised his assessment. That was genuinely quite dumb. Sylphiette forgave him eventually, after sufficient apologies and reassurances. She remained wary of physical contact for some time, which was understandable. Rudeus suggested she grow her hair out. She said no. He suggested they practice silent spellcasting. She said okay. Some awkwardness lingered. They got through it. Months later, during sword training, Rudeus sighed. Paul grinned and asked if this was about Sylphiette. He offered advice. Rudeus considered the source. Paul had successfully kept the affection of a beautiful wife and the grudging tolerance of everyone around him, which suggested some working knowledge of human psychology, and said yes please. Paul's advice. Rudeus had been showing only his strengths, which was making Sylphiette nervous. He needed to show his weaknesses. Share what he was bottling up. Let her bridge the gap. Paul delivered this with quiet authority and finished with, "Use your strengths to protect her, and she'll protect your weaknesses. That's how you keep a relationship going." Rudeus thought, this is technically emotional manipulation, but since the goal is to stop being weird around his only friend, he would accept it. He ran to find her. In the background, Paul said quietly, "What the hell did I just teach my 6-year-old son?" It worked. Rudeus showed up early, dropped his sword at Sylphiette's feet by accident, told her she was cute and he wanted to see her, and she had been cold lately. She grabbed his hand. She said he had been acting strange. She said she didn't hate him. She patted his head and smiled, genuinely, openly, and he was nearly moved to tears. She asked him to just act normal. He squeezed her hand and decided, yes, normal. He would treat her the way he always had, stop making things weird, and become what he privately described as an oblivious protagonist. The decision had a certain dignity to it. Shortly after, Zenith announced she was pregnant. The household was delighted. Names were discussed, hand-me-downs inventoried. Then, about a month later, Lilia announced she was also pregnant. The Greyrat family froze. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Then Paul said softly that the child was probably his. Zenith's hand rose. A red mark in the shape of a maple leaf appeared on Paul's cheek. An emergency family meeting was convened. Lilia stated calmly that she intended to leave after Zenith's birth, travel south to her hometown, and raise the child alone. Zenith pointed out this would require traveling a month on foot, recently postpartum, with no money, through a world that contained evildoers who would absolutely target a vulnerable woman carrying a newborn. Paul started to say something. Zenith told him to shut up. He had no standing here, and everyone knew it. Rudeus decided to intervene, not out of pure altruism. Lilia knew about the hidden panties and had kept quiet about them for years. He owed her. He put on his best performance of childlike innocence and asked his mother why everyone was sad about having 2 new siblings at once. Zenith said, with a complicated expression, that father and Lilia had done something they shouldn't have. Rudeus said he understood, but he had gotten up to use the bathroom once and heard father say through Lilia's door, "If you don't want me to tell anyone, spread your legs." Paul lost his composure entirely. Zenith cut him off. Lilia's expression flickered. The room chose to believe it. Rudeus pressed. It wasn't Lilia's fault. It was father's fault. The baby would be his sibling regardless. And Sylphie came to play every day, so wouldn't it be nice for a little brother or sister to have a friend their own age? Zenith sighed, looked at Lilia, and said she was family and she was staying, and that was final. The meeting was over. Later, Rudeus told Zenith privately that he had made the whole thing up. She patted his head and said she knew. She said she had prepared herself years ago for the possibility that Paul might do something like this. She gripped his head a little too firmly and told him not to grow up to be like that. She gripped harder. She told him to be nice to Sylphie. It was the firmest guidance he had received in either of his lives. Lilia's private perspective, which she would admit only to herself, she had been the one to initiate things with Paul. She had worked in the house 6 years, had her needs, and had chosen her moment when Zenith got pregnant and Paul was going without. She considered the pregnancy a fair consequence. What she had not expected was Rudeus, that unnervingly calm, strategically precise child, correctly reading the situation, steering the conversation to exactly the right conclusion, and saving her from a future that would have been genuinely dangerous. She owed him a debt she couldn't easily name. She resolved that once her child was grown, she would see them enter Rudeus's service. It was the highest repayment she could imagine. The months that followed were relatively calm. Sylphie's progress was remarkable. Intermediate tier spells without incantations, subtle effects, a control that outpaced her age group considerably. Rudeus's swordsmanship improved, but had not yet produced a single win against Paul. He was working on it. Lilia had softened toward him, talked occasionally, mostly about Paul's past. The stories were not complimentary. Paul had been talented at the training hall where they both studied. He had also skipped practice to chase women, and had, according to Lilia's carefully understated phrasing, forced himself on her one night and taken her virtue. The more Rudeus learned about Paul's history, the lower his opinion dropped. He remained fond of the man. He also thought he was trash. Both things were true at once. During sword practice one morning, Paul asked with unbearable cheerfulness whether Rudeus wanted to grow up to be a cool guy like his dad. Rudeus said, "Is it cool to cheat on your wife and risk destroying your family?" Paul grimaced. Rudeus asked him politely to keep his hands off anyone other than his mother. Paul said, "Other than Lilia, right?" And Rudeus told him that next time, Zenith might leave without a word. Paul went quiet. Then Sylphie appeared. She had come to find Rudeus, and had apparently overheard Paul saying she would be gorgeous when she grew up. Paul told Rudeus to repeat that to her face. Rudeus declined. Sylphie said she thought Rudeus was cool. Rudeus grinned. Nobody had learned anything. It was a perfectly fine morning. Not long after, Zenith went into labor. It was a difficult birth, breech, prolonged, with the midwife at one point suggesting there was no hope. Lilia applied everything she knew. Rudeus cast healing spells continuously despite being mediocre at them. They got through it. The baby arrived crying healthily. It was a girl. Rudeus's first thought was relief that it wasn't a little brother. He had experience with little brothers. Their relief lasted as long as it took Lilia to also go into labor. Premature, this time. The midwife, who had struggled with the breech delivery, turned out to be excellent with premature births. The second baby arrived, also a girl. Paul chuckled with the sheepish expression of a man processing how he had produced 2 daughters in one day. Rudeus watched and saw, for the second time that afternoon, the grin of a new parent, completely unguarded, completely genuine. Paul was a disaster in many respects. That expression was not faked. Zenith's daughter was named Norn. Lilia's daughter was named Isha. Rudeus was now 7 and had 2 little sisters, both of whom expressed their views on the world primarily through screaming. Paul and Zenith proceeded to have a shared, sustained, nervous breakdown. Lilia remained perfectly calm, tended to both infants with systematic efficiency, and observed that Rudeus had been easy, far too easy, and this was what real childcare looked like. Rudeus, who had extensive experience with his younger brother's infancy in his previous life, changed diapers and helped with laundry without complaint. Paul watched him with the expression of a man deeply embarrassed by his own inadequacy. He was a first-rate swordsman, respected by the village, admired by many. He did not know how to fold laundry. It was his second time being a father. Good grief.